Avengers Endgame is easily the biggest Marvel Cinematic Universe movie yet, and we're gonna get pretty spoiler heavy talking about Iron Man's story. So if you haven't seen it yet, go away. This is your only warning. Avengers Endgame is filled with emotional moments, high-profile deaths, and quite possibly the end of the road for some of your favorite superheroes. And while it's been said that Black Widow's death and Captain America's time travel romance did the movie no favors, it's hard to argue that the end of Tony Stark's story was anything but perfect.
We're the Avengers. We can bust arms dealers all the livelong day, but that up there, that's the Endgame.
Having Tony be the one to snap his fingers and finally turn Thanos and his minions to dust was incredibly satisfying. What's more though, of anybody who could have possibly stopped the Mad Titan, nobody deserved it more. If you go back to the first Iron Man movie, the Tony Stark we meet is egotistical, rich, and cares little about anyone but himself, at least on the surface.
The best thing about Tony is also the worst thing. He's always working.
After being kidnapped because of the weapons his company makes and seeing the damage they inflict on the innocent though, he turns his life around. In that cave where Tony was being held captive, Iron Man was born, and that was just the beginning of his roller coaster journey as a superhero, which also ended up seeing him become the most relatable Avenger. While the MCU franchise of films is often about heroes going up against villains, oftentimes we were shown Tony battling against himself and his own flaws, attempting to become something better. It may be hard to relate to a billionaire, but the MCU made it work in a way that a Batman movie never really could. That was most evident in the wildly underrated Iron Man 3, which plays just as much as a character exploration as it does a superhero movie. In it, Tony is reeling from the effects of the Battle of New York in Avengers 1. While Thor: The Dark World and Captain America: The Winter Soldier don't really spend much time on the aftermath of Avengers, Iron Man 3 shows Tony suffering. After going through a wormhole and seeing just how massive the galaxy is and the threats it can bring, Iron Man 3 shows Tony Stark suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety attacks.
How did you get out of the wormhole?
What we see is an incredibly human response to what Tony went through in Avengers 1. It's the sort of thing the MCU does well, highlighting that just because a movie ends doesn't mean everything that happened to the heroes ends with it. In the end, what helps Tony start to heal is the people he cares about. Pepper Potts, Happy Hogan, and a little boy he meets in the movie named Harley. This emotional story was the perfect way to rebound from Iron Man 2, which wasn't very good, and it painted Tony Stark as a human first and a superhero second. That image was only enhanced in Captain America: Civil War. Throughout the film, both Tony and Steve simply want to keep the peace between the Avengers and the rest of the world, even though that brings them in opposition with each other. Watching friends fight is no fun, unless they have special powers, and then it's a lot of fun. But what makes Civil War work so well, and by extension Tony's role in it, is the personal stake he has in what's going on. The mother of a young man killed in Sokovia blames Tony for what happened there in Avengers: Age of Ultron. Beyond that, once Bucky enters the picture and Tony learns the truth about his parents' deaths, the uneasy friendship between Steve and Tony is buried, for a while at least. And honestly, you can't really blame Tony for wanting to kill Bucky.
This isn't gonna change what happened.
I don't care. He killed my mom.
The anguish Tony feels in that moment is so raw that it hurts to watch, but it's hard not to be on his side of this argument. And that brings us to Infinity War and Endgame. It took Thanos killing half the universe to bring Tony and Steve back together. But when it finally happens, it doesn't necessarily go the way Steve probably wanted it to go. Tony felt abandoned by Cap after Civil War. When Peter Parker turned to dust in his arms, Steve wasn't around to help do anything about it, even though he promised they'd always be there for each other in victory and defeat. And while Steve was fighting his own battle against Thanos at that point, all that's going through Tony's mind is how his friend simply wasn't there for him. The logical thinker is gone. Instead, Tony is emotional and frail and mad at his friend simply because he's there and someone that Tony can be mad at. Cut to 5 years later though, and Tony has finally found his peace. Marrying Pepper and having a daughter completely reframed who this character was at his core. For once, he didn't think about suiting up as Iron Man and chasing down some kind of higher purpose. He'd found his purpose in his family. Of course, the mission is still there, and Tony agrees to help the Avengers with their wacky time travel plan to just kind of jump around in time willy-nilly, but he has one priority, and that is the survival of his family. Everything else takes second place. Ultimately, it comes down to one last fight against Thanos. Tony sees the only outcome in which the Avengers can be victorious is at the expense of his own life. Ever the hero though, he accepts that sacrifice. Tony has become the kind of person Cap described himself as in Civil War.
If I see a situation pointed south, I can't ignore it. Sometimes I wish I could.
No, you don't.
And when it comes time for the funeral of Tony Stark, his true legacy is there for the world to see. Yes, the Avengers are there, and Nick Fury is there, and just a bunch of superheroes, including his BFF Spider-Man. More importantly though, Pepper is there. His daughter Morgan is there. His friend Happy is there. And standing near the back is Harley, who is no longer the little kid Tony mentored in Iron Man 3. Tony Stark was the beginning of the Infinity Saga that launched the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's only fitting that he be the end of the Infinity Saga as well.
I am Iron Man.
So what did you think? Did you find Tony's story in Endgame to be a satisfying conclusion to the Iron Man arc? Let us know in the comments or find me on Twitter. I'm at Chris Hayner and I'm here for you to yell at.